I'll just pop my slides up. Hopefully everyone can see that. Great. So thank you everyone for having me here today and for coming to this talk. I'm really excited to chat with you about some of the science communication and outreach opportunities that I've been involved in over the past couple of years, and just maybe some things that you might find interesting as well. So I think one of the first things that I like to do before I start any sort of SciComm avenue or outreach is really think about three main kind of questions that I ask myself, which is what are the achievements, the audiences, and the avenues? These are a little bit more self-reflective, just to kind of understand what the right approach might be for myself as I go forward into a new endeavor. So in terms of achievements, like what are you wanting to achieve with this outreach opportunity? Why are you doing what you're doing, and that ultimate goal of your session, whether it's a short or long-term endeavor? And also, are your actions matching those intentions that you have? This is more of a reflective question I like to ask myself to kind of get to the motivation of why I'm doing what I'm doing. Like, is this just a line for the CV, and do I really care about this opportunity, or is this something that is near and dear to my heart, or something that I really feel like is important for the audience to partake in? The audience, or who you're wanting to reach in this opportunity, whether that's a question about the age or demography of the group that you are wanting to talk to, what their history with science is and their prior knowledge, whether that's with the specific group that you're engaging with, or their historical background and history with science. And then also what matters not just to you in this endeavor, but also to them, and what your audience really is caring about. And then lastly, the avenue, or so how do you want to reach your audience? What medium you might be comfortable with. You don't have to be comfortable with everything. And if you're not, like, I think it's really important to understand that maybe you don't want to Zoom with people and you're more comfortable with a slower paced environment that gives you chance to formulate thoughtful responses, or maybe you like to shoot from the hip and talk to people on Zoom all the time. I think that's important to understand before you agree to some of these opportunities without kind of taking time to understand your comfort level. And also the way in which you want to engage with your audience. So are you wanting to disseminate your knowledge in more of a monologue, or are you looking to have a bit more of a conversation and have a dialogue with your community? Those are kind of my three main questions that I like to ask myself before I get started in anything new, and also kind of come back to this as we go, or as I go through these opportunities, so that even 2 or 3 years into a program, am I still actually achieving what I want to? Am I reaching who I want to reach? And do I think my audience is even benefiting from me being there? And so thinking about ways of communicating effectively as early career researchers, I'm assuming most of us are here because we value SciComm and we want to consistently add tools to our skill set. But we also can be trained and kind of stuck in our own fields, communicating with other people who know the same background information that we do. And it's hard to distill our knowledge into effective and approachable ways of delivery. So for some of these more self-directed forms of science communication, I found a really helpful tool for me is to refine my approach using the message box from Compass. So our main way as scientists of disseminating information is through publishable articles and reports. In academia, it's our currency. And our standard approach is give background, tell you how we did a thing, tell you what we found from the thing, and then maybe wrap up with some of our thoughts about the things that we found. But when we're trying to reach outside of our circles, this isn't necessarily the most effective way of conveying our work. It tends to be a bit more engaging to try to hook people in with the result, give them this why does it matter context, and then come back to how this fits into society and the prior knowledge that we have about this issue. So we often have to flip our trained way of communicating on its head a little bit when we're trying to reach other areas of the public, or honestly, even scientists outside of our own fields. I find this really helpful if people communicate to me about things that are not ecology and genomics and bioinformatics in this other inverted pyramid, rather than the way that we communicate within our own fields. And so the message box is a really simple and kind of ever evolving tool that helps me refine my approach to SciComm, largely driven by the audience that you're trying to target with your outreach. This box can be filled out in any way or order that you like, so long as you start with the audience that you're addressing. So right at the top here, you can fill in your audience, whether it's for a SciComm outreach opportunity, or you're talking to policy and decision makers, or again, scientists outside of your own field. And then I find it really helpful to go from the audience straight into the issue. So broadly, what are you working on? This doesn't have to be some grand challenge or open-ended question. I tend to find that just using a few key terms can be really helpful here. So I'm currently working on the impact of landslides on salmon genomics. That's probably what I would just put into this issue box. It's not a question or really inherently a concern, but more of just a statement. Then you can go through and fill out this box in any order that you're interested in, whether you want to start with the problems and then pivot to solutions. So what can be done as we address this problem, or what are you going to do to address it? Then into either the benefits or that kind of so what aspect of why does the community or society or audience in general just value this issue or solving this issue. This is for self-directed or self-motivated SciComm, I find this to be a really helpful tool for me to refine my message, and I find that it changes with your audience. So even if the issue is the same, the problems, solutions, benefits, and so what element might be very different depending on your audience. And so with that in mind, thinking about going into some of these more self-directed or motivated avenues of SciComm, I wanted to kind of touch on first what I'll call the usual suspects of SciComm, which are either very broad outreach organizations, they're fairly well known or advertised, or on the other end of the spectrum can be a bit more field specific. I'd be remiss to have a talk about SciComm outreach without talking about Let's Talk Science. This is a huge campus-wide presence organization across Canada and other countries. I hope that you've heard of it before. If you haven't, it's an incredible organization that does mostly like hands-on demo-based science communication, where you are provided as a volunteer with training and a curriculum to teach like how to extract DNA from a strawberry. And then you're able to do that at science fairs, classroom sessions, summer camps, that sort of thing. Flipping from a huge presence across the country to something that's a bit more smaller regional competitions, things like iGEM or science fairs are only made possible usually by scientists that volunteer to either help organize or judge these competitions. I'm on the West Coast. We have a Vancouver Island Regional Science Fair that I volunteer as a judge for, which is sometimes these are the first avenues that students are able to approach and do their own science in, and they can be really formative in the way that they think about the rest of their careers. Going to something that's a little bit more specialized organizations, for me as an informatics scientist, Girls Who Code is a great organization that provides resources and curricula to help you start a chapter in your area or to teach workshops with an existing chapter. Lots of these types of organizations do exist for field-specific outreach. So I would encourage, obviously not everyone on here is a coder, but I would encourage you to look into some of your kind of field-specific organizations that might be in your area, or setting up chapters that are available. And then 500 Women Scientists as well, along with all the other amazing work that they do, also have outreach, education, and communication as some of their main tenets, like all of these organizations do, and can be a really great way to gain SciComm experience with the help and support of a large network behind you to help in your training and giving you opportunities to potentially reach communities that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. And then for something that's a little bit more mature or adult focused, like Pints of Science or Science by the Pint and Nerd Night chapters, these provide outreach opportunities to adults who may not have the support of, say, motivated educators in their lives anymore to continue to expose them to these topics. And these are really fun, more informal ways of basically going and grabbing a beer with members of the public and talking about a particular topic or challenge in science. And they're really fun to both attend and volunteer for. So these are my kind of like, if you haven't heard of these organizations, I strongly suggest checking them out. They're awesome to work with. But I wanted to do a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the more grassroots organizations that I've been volunteering with for the past 5 years or so. This is a disclaimer, I'm not paid by these organizations. This isn't like free marketing. I just think they're really awesome opportunities for some self-directed SciComm and outreach, and are really accessible to early career scientists. The first one I wanted to touch on is called Skype the Scientist. This is an organization with the goal of personal, accessible, and fun interactions. You basically get matched based on interest and age group with classrooms or interest groups across the world in any language that you're comfortable communicating in, to be able to virtually come and meet a group and talk about a topic that they're either learning in school or your research. And you get these real-time in the room connection with a group. So getting letters like this after a session, this one was from a brownie troop that I chatted with, just really showcases that like these connections are real, and the impact that you can have by speaking with these groups, even if it's about something you don't research, like turtles, can be something that is really does kind of draw into a new group or demographic that may not have had access to a scientist. You also get instant feedback and very genuine conversations. Kids are hilarious and smart and inquisitive, and maybe some of their initial questions that they want to ask you are Googleable, but it's so fun to have these genuine conversations and to see where their imaginations and their minds go as you're chatting with them. So it does lead to some of these more genuine conversations that you can have in real time. And it's also super flexible as a scientist for commitment. Our schedules are all typically off the wall. You basically just give them your interest in age groups that you're wanting to speak with, from kindergarten to adult groups, religious or faith-based groups, or even incarcerated individuals, as well as the time commitment that you're interested in. So this could be as few or as many sessions that you want to host in a semester. And then you're matched through their system with the educator or group leader, and you just take it from there. They are there to provide support for you, but you're also just able to kind of self-direct this science communication opportunity yourself. Another organization that I've worked with is called Letters to a Pre-Scientist, which is a pen pal program that connects grade school students with STEM professionals. They have goals of humanizing STEM careers and demystifying these lives that we've chosen to embark on. They want to broaden students' awareness of who can become a STEM professional. We're really used to seeing a man in a lab coat where no one's listening to in some sort of zombie apocalypse movie as our idea of what a scientist is. And this is a way to try to break down what and who can be a scientist, and also to just in general inspire students about what a future in STEM might look like for them. I really love this program because it focuses on low-income schools with maybe not the most resources, and provides all of the money that it needs to run a snail mail pen pal program. And it has a no opt-out policy, which means if a teacher signs up their class, their whole class has to participate, which means you might get a student who is super stoked on science, and it's so fun to talk to them about what that might look like for them in the future. But you also have the opportunity or the possibility of getting a student who isn't into science, maybe got a bad grade in their class, or just doesn't think it's for them. And finding common ground with those students and having conversations where they maybe didn't see a place for themselves in science is just a really incredible experience. You get these year-long one-on-one connections. So you and your pen pal write 4 letters back and forth to each other throughout the school year. You get to answer their questions that they might be interested about you. You get to ask your own questions, and you follow a general theme that Letters to a Pre-Scientist wants you to sort of touch on, but they also give you so much freedom in writing whatever they want or whatever you want to in your letters to these students. You do get matched based on your interest with the students. So typically you have some common ground as a starting point. If you're a marine biologist, you'll probably get matched with a student who likes the ocean. I get matched with a lot of students who like video games because I work in computational biology, and that's usually a pretty fun way to get started, is you get to talk about what cool video games you're playing these days or what sports they're interested in. LPS also provides a ton of training and support both ahead of time before you're matched and after you're matched in case you're ever worried about how to approach different topics or questions. And then the last one that I'll touch on really briefly is an organization called STEM Fellowship, which is focused on student-driven experiential learning with a large network that is very flexible. They have a ton of mentorship programs. I'd strongly suggest looking at all of them through their organization. But in general, their research exploration opportunity that I wanted to touch on is a little bit more of a short-term, lower stakes type of outreach opportunity, where essentially you get a new lab member for spring break. It tends to be a senior level high school student where they shadow you for the week. We're doing it virtually this year, so they're going to be on Zoom. They go to your lab meetings, they go and see you in the lab, they see what running an experiment is like. And rather than just talking about your science, they actually get to see what that science looks like in real life. And then they wrap up their week with a symposium presentation of what they learned or discovered about science to the rest of their REO program at the end of their spring break. And it's a way for you to really just kind of open up that door and break that barrier down, say, this is what doing science looks like in real time. So those are some of the people that I've worked with in the past. Thank you so much for your attention. I will put these slides on a Google Drive that's accessible during the general question and answer period in case you want to take down some of these notes or the message box stuff. But I would just be, thank you so much for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions or talk about some of the content that I have here.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Does anyone have any questions for Sarah? I will start before anyone else butts in. I'm just curious, what was your first ever science outreach experience and how did it go?
I think the first one that I can think of in like recent, well, not recent memory, but in terms of like when I started understanding what science communication even was probably when I got involved with Skype a Scientist. And it was so nerve-wracking because I asked the teacher to kind of like prep their students with a few questions, and they did. But those questions only last so long, and then the students just start going like off the rails with anything they can think about. And they're like, how old are sharks? What's a turtle eat? And like you get everything all over the place. And it was so fun, but that kind of shooting from the hip, like quick fire question and answer round can be a little bit intimidating. So, and then there's also, you get questions like, what do we do about climate change? Right after you answered how old turtles can be. And it's just like this like breakneck change of pace, which was super fun. But the first time I did it, I left after a 45-minute class and I was exhausted. Yeah, it was great though.
Awesome. So our next talk is by Hunter Stevens, who is an instructor at Dalhousie University, and he's also a naturalist. So if you follow him on social media, you'll know that he is basically friends with all of the different critters in the world. So if you have any questions and you can't identify anything, at least for me, I always go to Hunter. So take it away, Hunter.
Thanks a lot for that intro, Suchinta. I'm just going to preface here. I've been dealing with some serious internet issues since Dr. Hannah's talk, which was wonderful, by the way. I'm sorry I couldn't catch the entire thing. You'll notice there's going to be some overlap here, but I apologize if I'm cutting in and out a little bit. It's been stable so far with a couple hiccups, but I'm just actually hot spotting this, so we're gonna hope it works. But I've got a collaborator who pops in on Zoom calls from Norway in like field sites, so if he can do that with his cell phone, I'm assuming that mine can do the same thing. So thank you everybody for coming to the conference and for coming to listen to my talk. As Chinta said, my name's Hunter. I'm going to be here talking to you about the value of experiential learning to students of all ages. So not just university students, but also high school, elementary school age students as well. So who I am, I did this workshop with Diversity of Nature where we took students snorkeling and got to give them some firsthand experience with the marine environment. We're planning on doing a couple more of those this summer. I know that Suchinta is going to be talking about that later on today, so I'm going to keep it a little bit superficial. I'm also an instructor at Dalhousie University. I teach invertebrate biology at the moment, and coming up this summer, we'll also be doing the scientific diver course. I'm also a recent graduate from Dalhousie, but my upbringing is actually in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And I credit that with getting sort of a little bit more of a diverse experience with Canada's wildlife. And I became a little bit more familiar with the flora and fauna of Canada and broader North America because I had the opportunity to be outside and I got to do experiential learning as I was growing up. And so it's something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm very happy to be talking about it today. So we are always, well, most of the time, at least to me, I was always taught that the scientific method begins with an observation. That observation turns into a question, and that question eventually becomes the holy grail of academia, which is a publication. I, however, am of the opinion that students get the opportunity to make observations less and less. In the context of COVID-19, of course, everything has moved online. That's a lot less hands-on experience for students, especially in university. They're not able to get into the lab and actually work with specimens or work with the techniques and skills that they'd like to get familiar with when they move forward in their careers. And then even just younger students, there's a lot that's keeping them inside these days and keeping them from getting these opportunities to access experiential learning. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So as I said, observations lead to questions and questions into science. Questions at a young age can be held for a lifetime. I'm sure some of you already knew when you were kids that you saw something interesting and rolled with it, and that just became your passion throughout your life. It also teaches critical thinking. Why is this organism or this plant behaving the way that it does? It allows you to acquire new fascinations, and you can overcome your fear. You push boundaries when you're outside and you get face to face with these, in my realm, invertebrates. A lot of people are scared of spiders, insects, that sort of thing. Once you, get to know them a little bit, become more familiar, I think that understanding is the first step to overcoming a fear of anything. And then, of course, it also just leads to safer workspaces, both extrinsic and intrinsic. So by extrinsic to the workplace, I mean sort of the physical environment, if you're doing field work or something like that, where safety is a priority and concern. And then intrinsic as well, the teamwork that you establish when you're doing field and lab and all this hands-on work sort of leads to a better understanding for each other and just a stronger community or a strengthened community, which leads to a safer workspace to the individual, the person themselves. Young students, when they're given the opportunity to get some experiential learning or hands-on experience, they get to observe that wildlife exists in their backyard. So they get an immediate connection to the ecosystem that they share. And they're also shown that biology and their passions can be viable career paths. And so for me, honestly, growing up in Saskatchewan, when you say that you're going to be a biologist, one of the common responses is that there's no jobs in that sort of thing, So there was kind of this atmosphere that going into it was maybe a little bit less than wise of a decision. So getting this experience as a kid and showing, that, hey, I can actually take this thing that I really like and just, base my life off of it. It can become sort of this lifestyle for me, is really encouraging for them to see. It also shows that education is valuable and, encourages them to do well in school, which, sounds like I'm kind of a parent now at this point or something like that. But really, that's what it is. You're showing them that education can take you farther and to places that they've never really even imagined before. So it really gives them that motivation to do their homework and, stick around, do well in school. It shows also that sharing knowledge strengthens that community. So as I sort of touched on here, it just gives this impression to younger students that sharing is always better. There's no sense in holding knowledge from people or denigrating people for a lack of knowledge. It shows that sharing what you know with other people to supplement what they know is really beneficial to not only themselves, but their friends and family and everybody else who's around them. And then finally, as I say, everybody, regardless of background, is valued. It doesn't matter how much you bring to the table, or even if you are bringing something to the table. If you are coming there and you're coming with this learning attitude, I will always teach you. And I, would like to think that that is the same sort of mentality that is being passed down to these younger students. It's not just younger students, though. Older students get to learn and demonstrate safety, so safety procedures, and they get to pass down, what they wish they would have known when they were, sort of starting out in their career. Pass on that advice that you wish that an older student or just some sort of mentor had passed down to you when you were a child. As I said before, being in the real world is dynamic. It's much different from reading just an article describing a study site or something like that. And so it demands as a specific amount of situational awareness. And so giving a proper safety orientation and outlining things that students may need to think about when they want to explore the natural world on their own or do their own hands-on learning, safety considerations that need to be made, not only for themselves, but for anybody else that they are taking and showing what ecosystem they would like to be showing. I think this is really, really important to start students thinking about safety at a young age too. Just because it really does transfer as you're growing older. And if you can go into an environment that you're familiar with and where the safety protocols just sort of become secondhand nature, that's really beneficial to everybody who's working on your research project. I'm going to borrow the words of E.O. Wilson here. This is from the Letters to a Young Naturalist. And he says, "It is quite simple. Put passion ahead of training. Feel out in any way what you can or what you most want to do in science, technology, or some other science-related profession. Obey that passion as long as it lasts and feed it with the knowledge the mind needs to grow." I think that hands-on learning and just sort of overall this practical or experiential learning is one of the best ways that older students sort of come to realize what they want to study as they're finishing up undergraduate degrees or just entering undergraduate or even just beginning grad school. Having some sort of opportunity where they're placed into an environment and maybe given that avenue to pursue an interest and just make those observations, like I said, gives them this sort of ability to form their own questions, which can become research later on. I think that too often these days, and this is sort of a broader commentary on academia, just with the binds of funding and grants and all that sort of thing, is that a lot of students are not really able to pursue would like to be pursuing in grad school. Oftentimes you're sort of caught up on the projects of somebody else, or that's just where the money happens to be at that point. And, that can take its toll too and make a student really not as efficient because you want to be passionate about what you're working on. And I think that, giving students that freedom of choice to make that decision and ask their own questions is very, very important for the quality of their research and the education that they undertake. More so, experiential learning really teaches reverence for land and ecosystems. And I really do mean reverence. I mean, like, with every sense of the gravity of that word. You get a deeper understanding of the land's history, not just the ecosystems, but also the people. And so the pictures here, this hexagon is some of the Paleolithic stone art that is present here in Nova Scotia from Kedge Park in Nova Scotia. And then also this image down here is of the Beothuk people, which were, a pre-colonial civilization that existed in Newfoundland that is now extinct as a result of colonial activities. So it gives us this respect for the inhabitants past and present and acknowledges that the struggle to maintain traditions and to maintain land health is still ongoing. And, I quote Aldo Leopold here because I really do like his writings and I feel sort of a personal connection there. And you really start to value land for its intrinsic existence. It has this right to exist. It doesn't need to offer us anything. And we can treat land like we would a human being. And we also have to acknowledge that we are guests here. You know, I am very clearly a white man and I'm on colonized land. And so I recognize that being able to be on this land is a privilege. And when you teach other students about that, and especially younger students too, when they come to realize that people inhabited these lands for a very, very long time, even before colonization. Actually, just a week ago, I found a pre-contact projectile point at one of my snorkel sites. It's just a constant reminder that there is a history that runs deeper in this land than we really can superficially scratch the surface of by you know, just brief readings and anything like that. It's a whole set of knowledge on its own. So being on the land and learning about just prehistoric life and also the people that inhabited it beforehand really casts the landscape in a different light, I think. And experiential learning itself can sometimes lead directly to published discoveries. And so I understand actually Dr. Jen is here today, but this was taken on one of the coastal ecology Dal's summer seaside courses, where we were visiting Blue Beach, which is known in Nova Scotia for bordering Romer's Gap, which is sort of this period of geological time where tetrapods were sort of making their first forays onto land. And what Dr. Jen is holding there is actually one of the brain cases of tetrapods. And I believe it was actually the second only to be found. I'm not sure if it was ever, if it was just at this location, but it was a very, very significant fossil find, and that made the news. And, you know, it wouldn't have come up if we had gone any other day, but also if we hadn't done this field trip to begin with. So this experiential learning can really be beneficial in unexpected ways. One thing that has sort of been touched on is the inaccessibility of nature. So there's a lot of students that are coming from households that don't have the means to experience nature. And this can be because of transportation costs, equipment costs, or a lack of mentors, someone just to take them out into nature and, you know, sort of walk them through it. These images here on the top left is the current sort of parsing of land plots in Saskatchewan. You can see my hometown, Saskatoon, is right up there. And so a lot of it's these homogeneous of land without, you know, a ton of diversity. And I say that knowing that there's a lot of insect life and stuff that is still there, but it is very, very far from what we would call a natural ecosystem. I've always liked this quote that preoccupied with a single leaf, you won't see the tree, and preoccupied with a single tree, you'll miss the forest. This sort of comes down to, again, this idea of niche science to me, where people are sort of unable to ask their own questions, or they're limited to a very highly technical or niche aspect of a certain discipline, which can limit them in further career endeavors. Of course, it's really good to develop marketable skills right off of the bat and keep yourself going until you're into a place where you can sort of pursue your that freedom. But I think that it's important at an early age too, because it encourages, again, that critical thinking mentality, which is so critical for research and academia later on in life. So of course, there's the degradation of wild places as well. And again, borrowing from E.O. Wilson here, you may have heard the military rule for the summoning of troops to a battlefield: march to the sound of the guns. In science, the opposite is the one for you, as expressed in principle number 3. March away from the sound of the guns. Observe the fray from a distance, and while you are at it, consider making your own fray. So, you know, both stir the pot in academia. You know, if you're producing results and getting reactions, that means that what you're doing matters. So there's sort of a double entendre to that. Entendre, yeah. One of the ways that we can overcome these barriers is with urban ecosystems. So again, background here was from our coastal ecology class, where we were doing some field work in the Halifax waterfront. And these other two images are from a very popular local dog walking park. And so I am of the mentality that if you can't beat them, you join them. If you can't access wild places, learn about what's near you. Do you have an urban park of any description? Is there a pond? What are some of the methods that you can use to bring out the nature nearby? This park totally comes alive at night. I don't think a lot of people realize it. to a great breeding colony of yellow spotted salamanders and other amphibians. And again, like, it's a relatively small pond. It's like maybe 200 square meters. Public transit is an option, but less than ideal still. But urban ecosystems, I think, are really important because it establishes that immediate connection to the environment. One of the most famous being, what goes down the drain eventually makes it back onto your dinner plate, or of some description, something along those lines. But too often in urban centers and cityscapes, I think that we get disconnected from our ecosystem, and we forget that, yes, I am in fact still living in an ecosystem. There is organisms that share this space with me. And so exploring that really gives these students that sort of aha or eureka moment that, hey, oh, I don't actually need to go, several hundred kilometers around the world to experience nature. I can do it right here in my own backyard. Another great way to do this is through community outreach. So I talked a little bit about this snorkel workshop. Again, I'm going to leave it mostly for Suchinta to talk about. But, this was sort of the result of a whole lot of collaboration. I was approached and asked, based on your prior knowledge and experiences, do you think that this is something that we could do, that we could organize? And of course, I said yes. But it does cost money. I mentioned all those things: transportation, equipment, etc. Luckily, we were able to partner with a local business, a local scuba diving shop that gave us some discounts, and was, more than happy to sort of pay it forward and let these students use some of the rental gear. And of course, we did have federal funding as well, which helped cover those costs too. But again, if we didn't have that funding, it would have made it a lot difficult to run something like this. But, reaching out, my point with this is that reaching out into the immediate community too is also beneficial. There are going to be people that share the same sort of notion that getting students involved and outside is really, really important. So I guess my final take home message from this presentation would be, given the position that you as an individual are in, what can you do to make sure that students are getting an opportunity to have some sort of experiential learning or hands-on learning in your classroom or in your working environment? How can you help them make observations that are going to turn into science? The answer to that is going to be different from everybody. For everybody, everybody has a different situation, working situation, etc. But it's just something to keep in mind if you're planning course curricula, if you're planning experiments, even if you just want to get involved and volunteer with local nonprofits. What can you do, or what do you bring to the table that can help these students get outside and maybe get a little bit more of a head start into science and biology? And I get sorry, yes, and the real concluding message here is to remember your roots. All of this is done because we have a love for nature and for life, and so that's why we do what we do. It's because this world captivates us. So to put what I said earlier a little bit more succinctly, do what you can and make sure others come to know and appreciate it and why you do that. Do science itself. So thank you very much for listening to this talk. I hope it made it through without too much internet issue, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Hunter. That was great. Does anyone have any questions? I do have a question. So I'm wondering, so I know that some of these kind of things that pop to mind first, such as like going snorkeling or like going whale watching, these are immersive experiential experiences, but they're often costly. So do you have any recommendations for people interested in science communication and outreach who don't have the money available? Are there any cheaper ways to do this? Like a nature walk, possibly?
So yeah, so my background, like really being like snorkeling and diving and that sort of thing, you really put your kit together over time. Like that's just the reality. You start with the basics, like you can get a good used wetsuit for a good used rental wetsuit for less than $100, in my experience. And that is and a snorkel mask, and it isn't super expensive either. So you can start with those two things and just go from there. And then, you don't need to dive into it per se immediately. One of the other things too is take advantage of lesser traveled spots and also time. I realize that I'm saying this also as a white male, but one of my, favorite activities, I guess, in the summer is just going down to this urban park again, by myself. And that's where the caveat comes into play with a headlamp at night, and, you know, the ecosystem comes alive. And I guess there we would have another barrier too, is I feel comfortable going down into a forest at night in my hip waders with a headlamp by myself, but there are definitely people that aren't going to feel comfortable doing that. So one of those things that you can do is also just reach out to your immediate friend group. Do you want to come down with me to look for salamanders at this pond at night? It's weird enough that most people will say yes, and I'm telling you that from experience. So just kind of look in your, you know, it starts at home. Eventually you're going to get an interest, and you're going to start wanting to take it further. And so you can do that gradually to overcome financial barriers, but also just try to find, you know, workarounds. A lot of universities might have some sort of dive gear, or just some sort of field equipment, you know, just lying and languishing in the basement. There's another idea too, to any instructors out there: make that available to your students. If you know that that exists, like, tell them, if you want to take this and go explore something like that, sure, just bring it back. It's a very simple thing to do. There's another, again, it really just does depend on the person and what barriers are being faced. But I think a good way to start is that if you are facing some barriers, is to talk to somebody who's in that field, and talk to somebody who you know is working in the same sort of direction, and how did they start out, or do they have any advice for doing X activity for cheap?
Thank you so much. And I think when you're in the teacher position and you're doing science outreach, nature, of course, is always somewhat accessible. So for example, we recently did a salt marsh walk, which was very immersive, and it was absolutely free because the salt marsh is just there for everyone to enjoy. And a lot of the kids that came, they came from like local communities. They didn't even know that this place existed. So just kind of finding those free areas can be done. So where there's a will, there's a way.
Yep, exactly that. Where there's a will, where there's a way.
Thank you so much, Hunter. Our next speaker, Karma, who is a paleobiologist who is currently a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard University, and today he will be talking about the utility of museums.
Good. Can you see my screen, Jacinda?
Yep, you're good.
Good, great. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak to you guys today. It's been a really cool session, and it's really fantastic that I get to go third, because I figured, and I was right about this, that Sara and Hunter took care of a lot of the legwork for me, so I don't even need to go into the background here. I can just launch straight into it. So it's probably no huge surprise to a lot of the people here that a number of studies have pointed out that perhaps in an average person's lifespan, a large proportion, maybe even the majority of the science learning that they'll do doesn't take place in formal settings, which seems a little bit counterintuitive, especially for people who spend a lot of their time at museums. They're continuing to work at museums and universities often. But when you think that we only spend a relatively short percentage of our lives at school, and of that, only a small percentage is actually spent in science classes compared to other subjects, it's quite logical, I think, when you think through it a little. And so in that context, then, ignoring informal learning outside of strict classroom environments, is a huge loss of potentially. So obvious examples are all the ones that were just listed in front of me there very perfectly, that both Sara and Hunter described in great detail. So guided hikes, bird watching, if you can do scuba diving and snorkeling, I've done plenty of that too, and it is like unparalleled and very easy to get people excited about. Natural history museums are the ones, though, that I'm going to talk about today. I also wanted to point out diversity of nature. I've been following the stuff that Suchinta and Melanie are doing, and it's wicked. So it's like all of that stuff except made immediately accessible. So perfect example, but I'll talk about something slightly from a different perspective. So this talk, I want to sort of hit three kind of audiences here. The first is to talk to educators who are thinking about integrating museum content into your curricula, and maybe you haven't done it before. Here's a little taste of the kinds of stuff that we do that's not just the static material inside of the exhibits that's already existing. For museum staff or anyone who volunteers at museums and you're thinking about maybe taking the next step, what kind of more ambitious outreach ideas can I push forward? Here are some examples from my own experiences and their relative strengths and weaknesses. And then for all of us, we're all educators, or at least interested in education and outreach. How do we maximize the impact of these efforts? So it does take work to integrate things like museums into your curricula. So if you're going to take that effort, how do we make sure it's having the impact that you want it to, in terms of like the magnitude, but also like effectiveness for each individual? So I'm going to frame this around three different sort of sizes of audience. And so small group formats, I think, are what most people typically think of when you think about museum outreach. So typically this is someone goes onto the floor. That might be a volunteer, a docent. This is kind of similar to people giving guided tours. It could be students or the researchers themselves. They often bring specimens out. They talk to the public about them, answer their questions. Very classic, perfect sort of gateway outreach activity. For any of you who are thinking about volunteering at museums, this is really like kind of like first, most straightforward step. And you'll be shocked at how often we do this kind of work. And part of why you'll be shocked is, well, not everyone's going to the museum every single day of the week, but also it's often not particularly well advertised. So it often has sort of an ad hoc nature to it. So again, if you are thinking about, maybe one day in the semester or whatever, you're thinking about bringing your students or your attendees or your camp group or whatever to a museum, maybe just reach out to someone at that museum first and see if they're putting on one of these days. It's a very easy, no extra cost way to squeeze a little bit of sort of bang for your buck. These kinds of activities are very high on interactivity. So obviously you have a lot of one-to-one interactions. These are where you get your classic images of someone like you see in that picture, sort of kneeling with a specimen, kids are asking questions. You can often engage whole family groups at the same time. And what's really, I particularly enjoy is when the parents start getting more excited than the kids. That's always good fun. But they can be lower in terms of total engagement because you are dealing with small groups at a time, which can be a disadvantage depending on your goals. But it can also be ideal for catering to very specific needs. And so I'm going to frame each of these with an actual example from my time at various museums. So at the Smithsonian, we run a program called Morning at the Museum. And the idea is that we have doors open early for participants who would not be able to come to the museum under typical circumstances or standard hours. This could be children with different auditory needs, for example. That could be children who are deaf, but also ones who are very sensitive to large echoey noises. So, places like museums are absolutely awful for that. It can cater to, well, I guess what I'm saying is these small group format endeavors, I think sometimes get overlooked in favor of these larger, bigger, flashier ones. Because you get your name put on some advertisement, you have a big group, you're right in the center of a large audience or an auditorium. But in terms of creating a catered experience, and this is really directed at people who are, maybe thinking about doing these outreach events yourselves, this small group format is not to be ignored. I think it has a huge amount of unique advantage. So for example, when I did this for Morning at the Museum, a lot of what the science outreach I do involves, showing pictures of specimens, talking quite a bit, but instead we designed this around mostly tactile experiences. And so there's this really great paper talking about the design of tactile sort of exhibits at museums, and particularly in the context for them, how that's helpful for blind visitors. But I think it can be useful in all sorts of contexts as well. And also just generally, everyone likes to actually get their hands on a specimen, right? And not a lot of people get to do that very often, Not everyone has put their hand inside of a starfish, but if you've been around while I was doing outreach, that happened. And to the point about economics too, it never hurts to ask if programs like this are offered by local museums and science centers. So actually getting this catered experience, if you are trying to make that happen yourself, can be quite expensive at times and time intensive. But a lot of museums run programs like this, but again, not always advertised as well as I would like. So a medium group format. So this is most analogous to classroom style formal science education, but still quite different, and I'll explain why in a second. These kind of balance interactivity and engagement size in my experience. You have between a 10 and a 30 person group is pretty good. And what's great about these experiences, again, geared towards people who are maybe thinking about running these programs yourselves, compared to the small group format, I find it easier to design a specific curriculum. When you get people into the configuration of a classroom, we're so used to it, people start to fall into those roles very easily. You don't really have to do much. And so it's a good size and format for pre-scheduled multi-part programs, or when you have a more complicated series of ideas to transmit, where a one-on-one, just kind of casually talking to people may not be adequate. These are also fairly common, and I'm going to keep saying this, but reach out to your museums if you're thinking about integrating them in, because I see a lot of tour groups come in and they kind of just let their groups go hog wild in one exhibit, and then they'll collect them all and then they'll go to the next room. That totally works. You can get a lot out of that. But if you happen to synchronize your visit with this type of sort of event, then you get so much more value out of it, and you don't have to do any additional work. So I would say that these tend to be better advertised. They typically take more planning, and so we know about them further in advance. And so I think they're better targets to ask about, typically, if you want to integrate museums into your curriculum. And so again, an example, and you can see the pictures here, we ran a program which I co-designed called Dissecting the Tree of Life. So this was a 6-session program run over several months, where a museum scientist, that's me in the top here, that's the curator of dinosaurs from the Smithsonian, and that's another postdoc who works in paleontology. We would dissect a couple of specimens per morning, and we would do it in front of a live audience to teach them about evolution, ecology, paleontology, a wide array of topics. And so these tended to be medium sizes, maybe 20 to 30 people were ever in the room at one point, but we kept it as a drop-in, drop-out sort of format, which again, I would really strongly advocate for if you're running these kinds of programs. You're not bringing people back to school on their weekends. You kind of want it to be a little bit more casual. And it does allow for a more kind of like low-key or friendly style of conversation between you and the students. And so because there's also, there's no exam or whatever that they have to be preparing for, you can kind of intersperse, cutting up a starfish like I am in the top here with talking to them about movies or what they may have done over their weekend. This is the kind of the interface, or like the kind of like bridging area between your traditional classroom and something that takes place in an informal learning environment. So, 60-ish attendees per 2-hour session, and we had 6 of these sessions. So I would say anywhere between 300 and 400 attendees over the course of the entire program, which I would consider, quite a success. But programs like this need good advertising. That's something I want to point out. Again, if you're at a museum and you want to make the best use out of this, it took a long time to plan this. And I wouldn't say we got a bad return on investment. I would say we could have definitely gotten way more. And we were planning on sort of rolling it out a second time and expanding our advertising, planning out programs a little bit further in advance. And then, I don't know, something went down in 2020 and we never ended up making that happening. So again, an option, but I'm going to next talk about what I would just sort of nebulously call large group format outreach. And I'm going to just launch right into an example here because it is kind of an odd subject. So it's anything larger than essentially the people that you can fit in the classroom. So one of the programs we ran was called Edge of Extinction, and it was a 5-day virtual summer camp to teach attendees about paleontology, paleobotany, reconstructing ancient environments, dinosaurs, interactions between all of these different animals, the interactions between science and art, which I know a lot of you are probably interested in. I'm personally super interested in. So you can tell it was pretty big in its scope, this program. So not just large in terms of the audience, but large in terms of what it required to design, and also the institutional support that programs like this require. So I would definitely say if you are, so again, for the museum professionals out there or people who are volunteering at a science center or some other informal education venue, maybe don't make this like your first attempt at running your own program. I would say if you've got a couple of years of lead time, it's definitely worth the effort, and I really enjoyed it, but it's a beast, right, to plan. They would require a ton of support, both in terms of staff hours, advertising to make good on the investment of all your effort, institutional support for all of the logistics. Don't underestimate that last part. Things like getting permission to use a room sometimes take an inordinate amount of time. So if you're new to this, maybe go with one of the first 2 examples first. So for example, to ground this, for this program, we had 2 co-hosts, one of whom was me. We had 4 to 6 education specialists at all time. We had 7 different rotating scientists come in and out. We had 6 to 8 question answering volunteers, many of whom had university degrees as well, to help run the Zoom sessions. So this is all virtual, as I pointed out before. And we had 2 professional paleo artists helping us run the program as well. And this was months of lead time, weekly planning meetings, post-meeting debriefs. It was a beast. And I only put these sort of GIFs at the bottom because this is an example of the kind of lead that we did. We started designing, what's the word for it? So we had like a sort of Twitter campaign to bring out advertisements sort of in the weeks preceding them. And we used this as an opportunity to show the students some of what they would be drawing in the future. And so here's the curriculum that we sort of landed on. And you can see it was a 5-day series of sessions, different topic every day, rotating science experts, at least 1 different science expert per day, 30 minutes of science, 30 minutes of art, and the students gradually built up a mural based on the Monday to Thursday sections and the instruction of these 2 really fantastic paleo artists. And by the end, the idea was they will have drawn an entire Cretaceous ecosystem and learned about all the things in it. And this the two paleo artists would teach them as they went along, and I would be following along as sort of a novice. And so I had a drawing at the end of the, my two-dimensional, weird, kind of like not fantastic Cretaceous ecosystem that we could all show and compare with each other. And there was emails back and forth with us and the participants showing each other what we'd drawn. It was involved, is what I'm saying. But it does pay dividends if you can run programs like this. Number one, because they are so large, these are the kinds of things you're going to get lots of advanced warning about. So if you are thinking about introducing something like this into your programs, this is the kind of thing you can definitely build around rather than just integrate and slide into your schedule. We had on average 500 attendees per day. It was truly exhausting. So you see why we had 6 to 8 people moderating the discussion. The numbers did go down, but totally normal. That's another thing. Don't be worried about numbers going down in multi-part sessions. Attrition is totally normal. It doesn't feel good at the time, but it's totally logical. And I've bailed on lots of things, including like online courses and stuff. So, if we do that, then of course, kids are going to do it too. But our engagement rates stayed high. So this is average number of questions asked per sort of attendee. So you can see it maintained consistently high. And actually, I was very gratified that dinosaurs didn't get the highest number there. I assumed that they would, and it made me feel very good that pollen somehow defeated them. And then our exit polls in terms of attendee satisfaction also increased over time. But of course, we're getting a winnowing down to the core group who really loves this material. So not trying to brag with that last one, just pointing out that this is a good format for collecting data, which obviously a lot of us are interested in. You want the data. The data makes it so much better afterwards. So that was one of the door here phrases I've said. And of course, since we ran this all over Zoom, we could collect information on where people came from, and we were able to have participants from many different countries. Obviously, it's the Smithsonian, so the concentration was in the US, although we did have one person join from Halifax, which was cool. So there's my local connection. And the reason I wanted to end on this map of showing where attendees come from is to point out, as was really nicely pointed out in the last talk, actually, access to quality science education is obviously not uniformly distributed across geographic or socioeconomic or racial barriers. There are all sort of historic inequities that make it differentially difficult to access good quality science education at reasonable prices or at no cost. So making programs free or subsidized is obviously an important step whenever possible, or finding grants to defray those costs. Just reach out to museums if you're acting on behalf of groups that are representing, for example, students from low-income backgrounds. I've done weekend tours for people based on that, where often scientists, when they hear it's a worthy cause, they're happy to jump in and just do some work pro bono. I mean, that's been my experience, at least. I haven't met too many jerk scientists. But digital formats, I want to point out, can be really great and make things so much easier for achieving these goals. And so I absolutely am not saying they're a substitute for in-person or experiential learning. I'm a huge advocate of those things. I also got into biology because I like to go outside and I like to look at beetles and stuff. I didn't get into it because I was like into spreadsheets or whatever. But these things can be a bridge, is what I'm saying. And so if the option is someone doesn't have the economic means to actually make it to a museum, pay registration, maybe parents can't take off a day to take their kids out there, at least these kind of online formats that reduce the barrier to entry can be a bridge for science education in these circumstances. And I want to point out too that COVID has by necessity made us all reasonably proficient at distance learning, distance organization. We're doing it like right now. So it's kind of a self-demonstrating thing that we're having this conversation. So all I'm saying is, as we hopefully transition back to more primarily in-person interactions, let's not lose perspective about what we can gain from these digital formats, but also how much that might help people that are, not necessarily the people that are immediately adjacent to us. That's something I really felt quite strongly during my time at the Smithsonian. And so I'm happy to take questions, but I always end on a slide that actually has information on it so I can just linger. These are a bunch of websites that have digital resources that you can click on and use right now. That whole 5-day program is all free, available on the Smithsonian website. That's the first link. You can follow along all hour-long presentations. You could even build the whole Cretaceous ecosystem, over the course of 5 days and replicate what we did if you like. There's some other fantastic resources here, virtual tours, which are quite fantastic. Things like social media make it easy to actually start interacting directly with scientists with very little filter. And I just want to point out 2 really great museum scientists that I know that you can follow and get weekly science content from. Yeah, so that's the long and short of it. I'm happy to take questions. I think I have some time.
You have time. Thank you so much, Karma. Does anyone have any questions? We definitely have time. So if you have a question, feel free. Aaron Judah?
Hi, Karma. That was awesome. Thank you so much for that. I was wondering about if you want to collaborate and partner with museums, do they ever allow you to utilize specimens off the grounds, or should these types of events always occur within the museum itself?
That's a really good question. So sometimes, so based on just purely my experience, sometimes they'll allow that if someone from the museum like volunteers to take the things. And so, for example, the Royal Ontario Museum has these very precious fossils from the Canadian Rockies, and they're highly insured. We don't want them out of the sight of researchers at any time. But I did bring them out of the collections, out of the museum a couple of times to things like science fairs or like into other buildings and stuff, with the sort of like, again, it might require a person taking their time to come facilitate that. They may not be comfortable just giving it to you, but it is possible. And every museum is super different. I know, for example, a lot of the museums are trying to create like 3D printed models of a lot of their specimens, which they are a lot more willing to just like lend out. So you get the tactile experience, but if it falls and breaks, no one will cry.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Do we have any other questions? I might ask one. So when I do science outreach, we often use museums here, and they've been exceptionally helpful, and they often host us for free. And of course, there's all of these interactive things that they have that we can introduce to the students. I was just wondering, has there been any cuts to the funding for museums, and how do you feel about that?
Have there been cuts to museums? Sort of within the context of like recently, we're all sort of under economic strain right now. I think that is the case, but even outside of that, there are a lot of cuts to sort of public education and museums in general, I would say. Sometimes that takes the form not even just of like a massive like obvious cut, but just like diminishing support for existing collections, which essentially forces people like kind of to do work for free or allow things to fall into disrepair. I mean, how I feel about that is probably pretty obvious. I could have talked for the next like 2 hours just about like how great museums are for education. And a lot of that is because I think, well, number one, I'm not going to get into the whatever socioeconomics of like decision making, but part of that is also I think people don't realize how much is kept in museums. They see the galleries and they assume, well, the galleries are there, so as long as there's someone to dust off the dinosaur bones, it should kind of take care of itself. But it's the real iceberg situation or glacier, whichever one has the little bit sticking out, the one that destroyed the Titanic. Most of the stuff is the collections underneath the water. It's gigantic by comparison. And if you see what's actually in the back of the collection of the museums, the education potential there, and I've given tours of the backhouse collections and things, I think people would have a better understanding of how much stands to be lost. My short answer is I feel very bad about it when the funding goes down.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? And last but definitely not least, for the speakers for this session, we have Loay, who is a PhD candidate at Dalhousie University studying phytoplankton. And today he will be talking a little bit more about how we can all use open source resources to enhance our science communication and outreach.
Hi everyone. My name is Loay, and I'm a PhD student at Dal. And I want to talk to you about a fun project that I'm doing at Dal using open source tools and technology in the hopes of maybe inspiring some thoughts and discussion about using open source technology in your research and in your outreach. So I study phytoplankton, and phytoplankton are small photosynthetic organisms that live in the ocean, and they come in different shapes and sizes and colors and species and so on. And they're very important because they absorb carbon dioxide and they form the basis of all marine food webs. And they're extremely beautiful. So naturally, I want to tell everyone about phytoplankton, and I wanted to do a lot of outreach when I started discovering more things about them and learning more about them. However, I quickly realized that outreach activities with microorganisms, such as phytoplankton, are quite difficult. And that is because they are tiny and we can't just see them. So one way to do outreach activities with phytoplankton is to show lots of pretty pictures like the ones I just showed you. But that feels like you're selling people short, especially when you go out to science fairs and you go out in the field and you have a bunch of pictures and you're like, oh, these are phytoplankton. So the other way of doing it is to kind of get people to imagine phytoplankton. So you can bring a bucket of seawater in and you just say, imagine there's millions of cells in this bucket of seawater floating around, and imagine what they could look like. And then you look around and people look at the bucket and all they see is just water. So that doesn't really work quite well. And you kind of have to resort to using some tools to actually connect your audience with these microscopic organisms. And it's kind of, Hunter touched on that a bit, where you need to have some sort of hands-on experience to develop a connection with the organism, and you need to observe it somehow. With microorganisms, it's a bit more difficult. You can't go on a nature walk and see phytoplankton. So you need to use some sort of microscope to do that. And this is when you get stuck between a rock and a hard place, because microscopes for outreach and for research come in two different flavors. The first flavor is they can be very expensive, very complicated to use, heavy, and not suitable to take out the lab or a museum, for example, and show people your samples. So this is an example of a very fancy microscope and the type of images you can get with it. So even though they are expensive and fancy and so on, they take amazing pictures. You can see a lot of details with them, a lot of color, and they can be very inspiring when you start looking at images underneath them. However, we don't typically use them for outreach purposes because of the reasons as I just mentioned. They're just very heavy, they're very difficult to use, and they're very expensive. One time I convinced the professor to lend me a microscope like that to use in an outreach event, and I managed to take it just down the hallway, and I didn't look at it for 2 minutes. I was talking to someone, and my heart stopped when I saw a kid climbing on it and trying to hold on to these two eyepieces. And at that moment, I was like, okay, no more big microscopes because I cannot afford to break one of these. I'll get fired. And the other option is to use a less expensive microscope that you might have sitting in your cupboard for 20 years. And you take it out and it might work well, it might not work very well. And more often than not, the images that you get out of these are not great. So you put your sample in there and you get super excited to show people, look at these microorganisms, and all they see is some dots and some shading and maybe something useful, maybe not. So we need to get to a solution where we have an instrument, a tool that is portable and that is robust. So we're able to take it out of the lab, and it's able to handle some sort of use by inexperienced people. And it needs to be easy to use. So, you need to be able to show it to other people, and you need to be able to handle it and use it themselves. And also needs to be inexpensive, because the more expensive a tool gets, the more reluctant scientists get to take it out into the field and get other people to use it. And it needs to have really good quality in order to show people what you want to show them. Now, there's a lot of tools out there that meet some of these criteria, but I think the ideal tool that you need for outreach needs to meet all of these criteria. So you can get a microscope that is very good quality and that is very robust and portable, but it's going to be very expensive. Or you can get something that is inexpensive and easy to use, but it probably won't be of really good quality. So I was kind of starting to get discouraged because I attended a few outreach events with various, and the more impressive thing about it is that it's all open source. So the entire design of the instrument, from hardware to software, are all available online with instructions for assembly, and the parts for it are easily accessible from either you can get them online or from hardware or electronic stores. So I wanted to build one right away, and what I did, instead of just building one on my own, I formed a little collaborative at Dalhousie with a variety of students from different backgrounds. And we applied for some funding from various groups, and they were all extremely generous with either giving us a little bit of monetary funding or in-kind funding or some space to work and so on. And we worked on this slowly as we progressed through the COVID shutdowns, but we managed to actually build and use one of these instruments. But before I get to talking about the instrument, I just want to share something about the process of getting to building the instrument and why open source was so great in this respect. So because we couldn't just go and buy this instrument to use, we had to build it ourselves. And we ended up learning a lot about teamwork and working with people who have different scientific backgrounds and different personal views. You know, some people were really interested in the electronics. I was really interested in what we can do from the biology perspective. So we ended up learning a lot from each other and learning about electronics and how to solder things. We learned a lot about coding and software. We learned a lot about engineering. So it was a great learning experience just to build this instrument and get it to work. This is what the instrument looks like from the design perspective. This is just kind of the box shadow picture of it. You put the sample in, the sample goes through some fluidic system, and the fluidic system passes through a series of lenses that image your cells. And then those images are used later on for identification and counting and size measurements of the cells. The Planktoscope that we built, we made sure to use clear acrylic for the walls and most of the structures. And this way, when we use it for outreach, people can see the inside of the instrument, and then you can see the flow of the liquid or whatever you're passing through it. And you can see all of the electronics and all of the mechanical parts. And this is just a video I took of the first time we actually plugged the instrument in and poured some water in it. This is before we did any calibrations or none of us knew how to use it. We didn't know anything about it. And what you can see here is all these cells. These are phytoplankton cells passing through it. And I was freaking out because usually these cells, to see them, you need a high-powered microscope. And I was very surprised that our little $200, $300 instrument is able to capture what a $40,000 instrument does. And we just had it on a table with some wires sticking out of it. The quality that comes out of the Planktoscope is exceptional. So this is a paper that was published by the group that designed it. And they compared image quality from the Planktoscope against a flow cam. And a flow cam is an instrument that does something similar, but it's commercially available and it costs about $90,000. The top pictures that are black and white are from the flow cam, and the bottom pictures are the colored Planktoscope pictures. And same with this row here. So these are flow cam photos, these are Planktoscope photos of the same types of cells. And they did an objective kind of analysis of image quality and all that stuff. And you can read more about that in the paper. But I just want to point out more of a subjective look here. If you look at the cells from both instruments, the Planktoscope takes very good quality pictures compared to a much more expensive instrument. And in my very subjective opinion, in a lot of cases, the quality is much better than the laboratory grade instrument. Another example of this was more recently explored with someone who went to the Southern Ocean in Antarctica, and they took a Planktoscope with them. And on that ship, there was an instrument called the flow cytobot, and it's also an imaging instrument where you pass water through it and it takes pictures of the cells that are passing through. Flow cytobots cost upwards of $1 million. And these are the types of images that flow cytobot took on that same ship of the same cells that the Planktoscope took. And again, in my subjective opinion, the cells that the Planktoscope measured, I think, are a bit more mesmerizing, and there's a bit more detail in the Planktoscope cells than there are in the flow cytobot images. So just purely from a science outreach perspective, the Planktoscope provides very high quality images that are able to capture the imagination of the audience, but it's also a lot less expensive and very easy to use. Our group is still is in its infancy, and we still have a lot of work to do. So we have a lot of planned activities with this instrument, and the first one is to look at further testings and calibrations of the instrument that we built and see how it performs. But we also would really love to use it for outreach purposes with schools, communities, universities, and so on. And what's really cool about it is that even though we plan to use it for outreach, we can also use it for research because it does perform research quality work. So I will be taking the instrument in 2 months on an expedition to the Labrador Sea to look at the phytoplankton community there. We're also really interested in sharing the knowledge that we get from the Planktoscope with the community. So whether that's our experience with building one of those and what we learned, it's open source, so we can customize it to our needs. So if you work with microplastics, you might need a different type of lens, and you just buy a different lens than what's available, and you can use that. And the other thing we're really interested in, and I was really excited to see with the iNaturalist, is we would like to upload a lot of the images that we take to online repositories like iNaturalist or EcoTaxa, where we can geotag certain species and use machine learning to help us identify what organisms we're looking at. And in the future, we're also really interested in attaining a bit more funding to build more of these Planktoscopes and to distribute them to communities and schools so they can go out and explore their environment, just like going on a nature walk. But instead, you just take the Planktoscope with you and collect some water from a pond or from the ocean and pour it down the instrument and get access to this microscopic world of organisms that would otherwise be inaccessible to you. And before I end, I just also want to get your attention to a few of my favorite open source instruments or tools that we can use in research and outreach. And one of those is becoming more popular now with the 3D printing technology becoming mature. You can 3D print a lot of tools, and one of those tools is a pipette. So a pipette is a tool that we use to handle very small volumes of liquid. And this pipette is, the entire structure of it is 3D printable and very easily put together. And it works just within the same level of uncertainty as a commercially available pipette that is, again, orders of magnitude more expensive. So you can use it in the field and in outreach activities without selling short whoever is using it. And one of my ultimate all-time favorites is using what's available in a non-scientific world to perform science and outreach. And one of those is using a pressure cooker or like an Instant Pot to sterilize things. Sterilizing things can be a tedious event. You might require some big industrial grade tools. But in this paper, they compared different pressure cookers and different brands of Instant Pots. And they were able to see that you can sterilize things very easily using pressure cookers. So if you're on a ship or in the field and you need some sterile equipment for a certain outreach activity or some microbiological outreach activity, you can just use something that's not necessarily marketed for science. And lastly, I just want to end with a quote from Manu Prakash, whose group contributed heavily to the design of the Planktoscope, and who, by the way, invented the Foldscope. So one of those quotes was in the meeting, and he said, think about the tools, but prioritize building communities. And that really resonated with me, because the sooner we can start thinking about science and outreach from a community perspective, the sooner we can have more of these open source tools available to everyone. But also we can start combining our scientific and personal backgrounds into these tools and developing them into better tools to be used for outreach and research. Thank you all for listening, and especially thanks to Suchinta and Melanie for organizing this very great conference so far. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Loay. That was Very amazing to listen to. I'm really excited for all of the plans you have coming up from the Planktoscope and the Plankto Squad. We already have a question in the chat box by Melissa who asks, can you tell us again how much a Planktoscope costs?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Planktoscope costs between $200 to $400, depending on what materials you use. It can cost a bit more for your first Planktoscope because a lot of the times the stuff that you need to buy for it are only available in bulk. So for example, you need to get a very small wire, but you can only get like 30 meters of that wire, and you need a few centimeters for it to build a Planktoscope. So your first Planktoscope might be a bit more expensive, more on the $600 side, but your second one would be exponentially cheaper. And that's why we want to build more of them. The more we build, the cheaper they'll get.
Thank you. Melanie, do you want to go next?
Sure. I actually have a bit of a general question for everyone. So maybe if Songla wants to go instead.
Sure. Songla, go ahead.
Yeah, just want to make sure that you know, maybe you already know that in the, let me think, the Dissecting campus, they have a thing called Dell Idea Hub, I think. That thing provides a lot of things, like just free if you want to build something. They have like they have a 3D printer, they have like a laser cutter, like everything. If you want to go and see what is available, you can.
Okay, I didn't.
Yeah, that's a great resource, and we actually used the resource and collaborated with them to build the Planktoscope. A lot of the 3D printing we did and the laser cutting we did was at that place, and they were great. And there was a lot of engineers there who were super interested in the Planktoscope from an engineering perspective and didn't care about the biology, and I love that. So, yeah.
Do you want to go ahead, Melanie?
Sure, yeah, this is a question kind of aimed at all of the panelists for this session. Throughout all of your presentations, I was sort of thinking about just the visual impact of the kinds of stuff you're doing, and thinking about, you know, Karma described the back end of a museum as being like the bottom of the iceberg. And it just sort of occurs to me that for the public to see kind of like what happens behind the doors of science must be quite amazing. So I was wondering if any of you can sort of describe the affect of members of the public when they've, you know, seen these sort of behind closed doors ends of science.
We just, is this a
I
free
think
form?
you just go
Everyone
for
jump
it.
in? I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure how polite to be there. I mean, it's incredible. So the Royal Ontario Museum recently opened its newest gallery, the first permanent one they've had in a while. And so a bunch of the stuff that's gone out there is stuff that was in the back, the invertebrate paleontology collections. And I've toured groups through there, and every single time they're like astounded. You know, like slabs the size of an entire wall just covered in trilobites, like the size of your torso. It's insane. And those are just like miraculous things that have to be there. And they just had like, you know, like scaffolding on them and stuff like that to keep them safe until we could get out there. So I would say like the change in perspective is definitely like, my God, like why isn't this stuff all out there? And the answer is mostly like, we need a room. So I'd say the affect changes pretty quick, I think, based on my experience. But that's all like museum, like very heavily collections-based experiences, not necessarily reflective of anyone else.
Yeah, so I used to work in public aquaria before getting into research, and kind of similar to Karma's experience, like when you tour groups into the behind the scenes of what goes into some of these educational displays and habitats, like, you know, we had a whole department just for life support systems that was separate from our team of biologists, just to keep water good for creatures. And I think that those types of, like, you know, behind the veil type of experiences are really valuable for people to understand, not just that, you know, this fish looks pretty or this piece of science looks kind of cool because we have a nice figure about it, but getting to see that sort of behind the scenes, I think, gives an appreciation for everything that goes into it, on top of being stoked about the science or the creature.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean,
I'm
definitely
stoked to see that Planktoscope thing. Just sort of side note, like, you know, like I didn't get to see a behind the scenes thing, but like I cannot believe how effective that thing is. And it's just like 400, $500. I just thought, like, why not strap like 5 of them together and then cruise through the ocean like some sort of marine god? Anyways.
Yeah, that's the plan. That's what we're planning to do. Yeah, so just to touch on Melanie's question as well, I think the Planktoscope does a great job at blurring the lines between the behind the scenes and in the scenes, because it's an instrument that can be used for research. Like, it is the research instrument, but also that same exact instrument, you can take it out and use it with outreach activities. Typically, you would have to bring people into the lab and show them these fancy microscopes or these fancy instruments, and they're like, ah, great. But then you go out to the outreach activity, and it's totally different tools that you're using. So I think the Planktoscope is starting to blur the lines between what's available to scientists and what's accessible to the public as well.
Yeah, that's great.
To kind of piggyback off of that, obviously I'm not involved in the Planktoscope at all, but I think it like really speaks to how inaccessible some of those big scary lab settings can be for the first time that you're getting to experience that behind the scenes. And those sort of like the ability to bring a tool like that into the field that does the science that you want it to do, but makes it more accessible, more hands-on in a more familiar environment is just, that piece of equipment is incredible. It's so cool what you're doing with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like this is all kind of falling into the theme of, you know, part of outreach and communication is connecting with the public and showing them what we as people are also doing, and what our daily lives are like. That human element is always going to be very interesting to people. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you all so much. So I just want to say you guys all did such an amazing job. This was an amazing session. So at this point, we will open up questions to the general session panelists. So I guess my question is, it's obvious that you guys are all doing both research and outreach, and often these things kind of exist as separate things. Do any of you have any ambitious plans for the future where you can potentially merge the two? So possibly do some sort of outreach activity that still results in a research publication?
So I can take a quick stab at this. I think that it can be really tricky to merge the two, and this might actually be a bit more appropriate for M if they're still on the line, but those type of community science endeavors, things like you know, backyard bird counts and iNaturalist bioblitzes, I feel like that kind of community science is really accessible and can result in some really cool observations and findings. Personally, right now, I work in a more genetics-y focused field, and I found a lot harder to get outreach opportunities that are directly related to what I do than when I was in strict field ecology. But that being said, I think that there are opportunities to kind of merge those two and kind of do a more like ecological genetics sort of focus. And I'm hoping that I can get something together that looks a little bit more like genetics of tide pooling kind of things, but that's still in the infancy of what I'm hoping to do.
Cool, thanks so much, Sarah. Anyone else want to chime in?
Jump in, but there's a more exciting answer that involves your crazy robot. I want to hear that, but I can go as well. So not so much one where like we've integrated it so much like that we're hoping for a publication to come directly out. Although the tricky thing with museum research often is some of the kind of research outcomes that we'd want from it have to do with things like actual visitor experience and stuff, which is something I'm interested in. But that does take forethought in terms of getting permissions to use data. So that's a bit of a tricky thing. And for where I am right now, I don't think it's worth the sort of upfront time investment versus how much it might slow down the progress of some things. But we are developing, and we have done this quite frequently, develop sort of like research programs and outreach goals in tandem. And so obviously the major exhibit at the Royal Ontario Museum was one of these. When I was at the Smithsonian, it was essentially, one reason I was hired was explicitly to shore up extra knowledge for their recently opening the deep time fossil halls. And so my research went in tandem with that. And then with the current research that we have this gigantic collection of fossils, and two things we want to do is number one, sort of produce a temporary rotating exhibit at the Museum of Comparative Zoology. So as we are sampling the fossils, we're going to be bringing them out. So there's that outreach component, but also creating like a website where we can sort of make some of this data more openly accessible, not just for researchers, but just for the general public, with information on the animals that we're uncovering, high quality photography. So, you know, you don't have to come to the museum in order to see them. So they're built in tandem, but and they sort of support the research. Honestly, they make me a better researcher too, because now I'm looking at a lot of specimens more closely, for example, for other features that I might have ignored if I was just, you know, counting them and putting them back in the collections.
Thanks, Karma. Loay, did you want to chime in on this question as well?
Yeah, briefly. Yeah. So I might have mentioned, so the Planktoscope was designed with sailors in mind. So they wanted it to be a tool that can be available to everyone who's sailing out there for leisure, or if you're crossing the Atlantic on your own yacht or whatever, you just get one of those Planktoscopes and take it with you and just collect samples. And it's meant to be a tool for citizen science. So the idea behind it is to make it so accessible that many groups and many people have one. And as you take pictures with it and collect samples with it, there's a lot of metadata that it also collects, such as location. There's a little GPS that you can put on there. And all this information gets uploaded to a central place. So right now we're using EcoTaxa, which is similar to iNaturalist, but I think it's more heavily focused towards microorganisms. And with the data that would be uploaded, including images and more like objective metrics, like sizes, species types, biovolumes, and even stress and other physiological states, the data that we collect as a community can be used to understand phytoplankton dynamics around the world and can lead to many publications. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question. Actually, no, wait, it's a science question. It's not about outreach. I'll ask you afterwards. Sorry.
Go ahead and ask it now. We have time.
So I don't know if this makes sense size-wise, but can these things, like if we were to like clean like substrate samples, could they be used for like rapidly identifying like myofauna and stuff? So are these plankton of like mud dragon-ish size? I don't know how myofauna familiar you are.
I'm not familiar at all, but the Planktoscope can be used to identify things up to like or to image things up to a zooplankton size.
Okay.
The Planktoscope itself does not identify the species or anything, so you take the images off of it, and then you use a machine learning algorithm, whether that's through iNaturalist or EcoTaxa or whatever. Gotcha. But you can, it is very adaptable to different sizes. You can go from as small as 2 microns all the way up to 500 microns on the same instrument, and that's quite
cool.
good. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And we have a question from Will.
Hi, yeah, I'm kind of just wondering generally if you have any advice for early career people in this field who are trying to seek out or create opportunities that combine research and outreach in grad school and beyond. And if you, Karma, actually have any specific advice on how to break out of like research and on the ground education into museum or aquaria jobs.
So, I mean, when you say break out of, sorry, I think I just asked, does someone else want to answer?
I can clarify. I just,
no, I think your question makes total sense to me. So you're talking about sort of like making the transition from doing just pure research essentially, which is often what happens in grad school, to doing things that are more on like the professional side of museums. Is that what you mean?
Right now I have like field biology and experiential learning as like an educator. And I would like to get into museum and aquaria.
Well, I think, you know, one thing, if it's just getting over the boundary of actually like making yourself like an attractive candidate to those kind of institutions, I would say highlighting the fact that a lot of the skills are exactly the same, whether or not it's like education using museum specimens or education on the fly, like in a field setting. I think, you know, there's a lot of interchange between people who do the kind of education you're describing and museum educators. And in fact, I think a lot of the best ones, particularly the ones I met at the Smithsonian, have done a lot of field work and they've done a lot of science themselves. And as a result, when they sort of spearhead education initiatives, it's informed by the exact kind of things that you're describing. So I think it might be more a matter of like not needing to do something necessarily different, but just rather making sure you know what aspects of yourself to pitch, if that makes sense.
Yeah, from the Aquaria side of things, I would echo what Karma said. The skills are super transferable, especially with field biology as kind of like your main skill set. I felt like when I was in Aquaria, you know, I had to MacGyver so many things that was like more field biology than it was anything else. And it's like, it's good to know how to take care of fish, but also you need to like wire exhibits with limited resources. And they also typically have things like water quality labs and animal necropsy labs. And so all of those things that you're used to, you know, troubleshooting in the field are really useful for those types of applications. And it's more just a reframing of your transferable skills that you already have, rather than pigeonholing yourself as only a research scientist. Those skills are usually quite sought after in those settings as well.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. That was a great session, as I mentioned earlier. And we are now going to move on to our third and final session, EDI and Ways Forward.